G'day folks and welcome to Australian UFO Sightings official podcast. I'm your host Anthony Goodall and you're listening to Encounters Down Under. Here we invite guests on the show to tell us about their encounters with aliens and UFOs, where most of our episodes were streamed live from our Facebook page, which gave listeners the opportunity to ask questions to our guests regarding their encounter. If you have had an encounter and would like to be a guest on the show, please get in touch with us. You can send us a message through our Facebook page, Encounters Down Under, or send us an email at australianUFOsightings@outlook.com.au. Be sure to join us on Facebook and share with your friends and family to help us grow, and hopefully encourage others to come forward with their encounter. If you're an iTunes listener and a fan of the show, why not give us that 5-star rating and review, and you could have your review featured on the podcast. But enough of that, let's get into what you've been waiting for. So kick back, relax with your favourite beverage, and enjoy the show.
How you going, Anthony?
Good, mate. Welcome to the show, mate. Good to have you on.
Yeah. I'll just do a quick correction. It was Hair of the Alien, the book, not Angel Hair.
Oh, why am I thinking of Angel Hair?
But the feel is incredibly confusing.
Yeah, no, that's sorry, mate. That's my fault there. I think it must have been when I was might have been reading a bit about your experiences there. You might have referenced it as like Angel Hair or something like that. I think that's what right, I might have. Yeah. I think that's where I've mixed it up from. But mate, great to have you on the show. Thanks very much for joining us on here, mate. It's been absolutely fantastic having you on here. So, mate, the idea here is to go and let people know who you are, what you've done in the whole UFO phenomena aspect of things, mate. So, by all means, mate, I'm going to let you take over, mate, and let people know who don't know who you are.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'll just sort of try and quickly cover, 40 years or more. That's not easy, but anyway. I guess I became interested as a young kid. I lived on the north coast of New South Wales, at Grafton on the Clarence River, and during 1966 there was it was a huge year actually historically. With the benefit of hindsight, 1966 was a massive UFO wave flat year right across Australia and in a number of places around the world. But in little old Grafton, where I lived as a young teenager, I was kind of just starting to become aware of the UFO subject, which more often than not still had the reference flying saucers and all that kind of stuff. And it was just slowly transitioning into that point. The nomenclature was UFOs, but during 1966, a lot of locals were reporting UFO sightings. I wasn't that lucky. I didn't see anything during 66, but one of the witnesses were two police officers that were pursuing UFOs across the countryside, and it got national, indeed international publicity. So that kind of twigged my interest, and between then and 1969, I started reading up. And in those days, there were lots of mainly paperback books that were readily available. And just give listeners a bit of an idea. I was kind of the main book that I got into was this little humble thing, if I can get it in the camera, right? Yeah. What we really know about flying saucers by science writer Otto Binder, and that was kind of one of my early kind of references to the UFO subject. And there's been an excellent biography of Otto Binder published and talks about his interest. And in fact, Otto Binder was very much a popular culture guy too, because he was into doing a lot of the storylines of Superman, and I think he created Supergirl, all that kind of stuff. So he was a multimedia kind of guy, and before we even knew the term, basically. And so that was one of the books that he published, what we really know about flying saucers. And it was a bit of a slow take up here in Australia in terms of books and that kind of thing. And the very first book that was sort of published in the field was this thing, Flying Saucers over Australia. And by a guy called James Hollinge, and that was coming out through, a colourful paperback publishing press called Horwitz Books, and they looked as though they tended to be put together probably in a couple of weeks, basically by pulp writers and that kind of stuff. But it was a good collection of what was happening, and that came out in 1965. And a few years later, they got this book going, Flying Saucers. Basically, where are we again? I better learn to put it in from the phone. Yeah,
If you
flying.
hold it back to where
Sorry.
your face is, people be able
Yeah,
to see it. Yeah, there you go.
yeah,
A little bit higher
yeah.
up.
So
And yeah, there
flying
you go.
saucers. Where do they come from? By Richard Tambling. Turned out Richard Tambling was more into it than was obvious. He turned out to be what they referred to as a contactee figure, and claimed, wait for it, that the entities that he was in contact were from Uranus. So I won't go down the other sort of smutty path line, but anyway, he was an interesting guy, but the book didn't portray much of that other than his flirtation with American contactee figures and some of the early photographs that were controversial. But when he just covered the local UFO scene, it wasn't a bad book, and it got a lot of people interested in the subject. And as I said, the big year for me personally, and also starting to get more actively involved, was 1969. Now, for the stuff that I talk about, I'll encourage people to get onto my blog site, which is called the Ozfiles blogspot.com. That a lot of things I'll talk about, there are bits and pieces in that blog site that'll expand what I'm talking about. But in 1969, there was a book published basically called UFO'S over the Southern Hemisphere. And that was kind of like a bit of a bestseller, all coming from Horwitz Books, basically. And so it was a popular kind of publication and publishing outfit for the people, basically. And what Michael Hervey did, which I think any hack writer could have done, basically, was that he trawled through all the UFO publications of all the civilian UFO groups of the day, and harvested all their material as much as he could get, and as many newspaper archives. And he also did a bit of a publicity hunt and said that he was writing a book, and a lot of people wrote to him. And so he was able to include a bit of a potted history arranged in by state. And in each chapter for each state, he would do a chronological kind of thing. The book suffered, it could have used a lot of kind of editing, but ultimately it was I think a worthwhile kind of overview of what was happening on the civilian scene in particular. And it was very popular during its day. But during 1969, it was yet another major UFO flap year. And it was really the thing that got me involved was that just to the north of Grafton, there was a place called Bunga Walban, and it was a farming property owned by the local member of parliament. And back in those days, parliamentarians actually had some credibility. But with this Mr. Ian Robertson, my family knew him, and I was able to get permission to rock on out there as a young teenager and go out to the property where a large flattened area was found, and of sackling crop, close cousin of sugarcane. And it got sort of huge amount of publicity across Australia and also internationally again, as to was this a location where flying saucers had landed. So this was my first brush with the UFO phenomenon up pretty close and personal, an apparent UFO landing. And there was all sorts of accounts there of people reporting stuff right all over the north of northern New South Wales. And there were dozens of these so-called ground tracers. Now, I know that in more recent decades, it's been popularised, and the term referred to them is crop circles. But really, I put a big demarcation between crop circles and UFO physical trace cases or UFO landing cases, because they're really not to my mind, a shared phenomenon. Crop circles are entirely different kettle of fish, and they became popularised in Britain during the 80s, 90s, and been subject to all sorts of controversial claims. And very rarely has there been a credible kind of UFO sighting associated with the creation of a crop circle. And then it became much more ornate, and then you had the whole field art, complex patterns. And once that started to happen, it was pretty hard to correlate any kind of crop circles with the classic UFO landing cases. But 1969, it was really on. And for those that are interested to pursue that further, you can check an article that I did a little while back on my blog that gets into 1969 in a big way. And yeah, I called it 1969, the Great UFO Days of Oz, and there's a reason for that. I used the spelling of days was D-A-Z-E, and I borrowed that from a book that was doing the rounds at that time, or more recently called I think Surfing Days or something of that nature, and it was a play on that because one of the witnesses that approached me was an Australian surfing champion, really controversial guy, Peter Druin, that claimed a UFO sighting back in 1969. So I got the chance to interview him at great length just recently and included his account on my blog. And so 1969 was also a complicated story because basically after a couple of years, Colorado University, headed by Dr. Edward Condon, had finally published a report. It was commissioned by the United States Air Force, and they had trouble getting a hold of the university to do an alleged serious scientific study of UFOs. And they finally, after a couple of years, published a 2-volume report that then got put out more accessibly as a kind of a paperback. And that came out in the beginning of 1969. And but luckily, as a kid, I was a bit of a voracious book reader, and I managed to get access to a hardback copy of the Condon report that was in the local public library of Grafton, and I almost had it out on permanent loan for about 6 months and probably read it about 6 times. And most people didn't read the Condon report, they just read the conclusions, and pretty much what Dr. Edward Condon concluded in the report was that after 2.5 years of study and a few $1 million worth, there was nothing of any scientific merit, and that students that showed a bit of an interest in UFOs, they should be given demerit marks if they took a serious interest in the UFO subject. But so basically it was a report that was essentially about moving on, nothing of importance here. Let's just move on. Flying saucers, UFOs, whatever they are, will go away. It's just a popular fad, and the only problem was that whatever UFOs were and are, no one informed the corpse because the corpse resurrected pretty quickly and did so in an amazingly huge way in Australia during 1969. And historically, Australia's had some years that have been major UFO waves, and 66, 69, 1972, 75, 1978, and people are starting to see a 3-year pattern. That's something that we picked up on heavily, active UFO researchers during the 70s and early 80s. But unfortunately, by the time 1978 came along, and that was a huge year, that cyclic pattern seemed to disappear, and we weren't able to keep as good a correlation on the huge waves that seemed to occur both in Australia and around the world. But by 1970, 71, I was sort of actively investigating UFOs around the north coast of New South Wales, and also particularly there was what we referred to as a UFO flap area, and the biggest one that we had at that time was down at Kempsey near Port Macquarie, and there was a lot of UFO sightings going on there. So I spent a lot of time in Kempsey, got to know the associate editor of the Macleay Argus, the local paper there, and she was acting as not only as an editor collecting UFO reports, she was actually channeling them across to the British Flying Saucer Review. So here's a local country New South Wales newspaper associate editor, Patricia Riggs, acting as a consultant for an internationally known flying saucer magazine based in Britain, the Flying Saucer Review. So a lot of the reports from Kempsey, New South Wales, were turning up in what was then regarded as one of the major UFO magazines of the world, and I had a bit of a front row position for that because I used to trot backwards and forwards to Kempsey a lot during those days, particularly right through to about 75, 76. But university drew me to the University of New England at Armidale, and it was during 4 years there when I did an honours science degree majoring in chemistry and mathematics that I set up there on the college campus a local UFO type of loose network, and we started to get known by a lot of the people around the area, media and all that kind of stuff. And so the word got around that if anybody had a UFO sighting, if they wanted to share it with anybody, report to some weird guy at Bellpage College on the university campus at the University of New England, and he'd take a look at it. And it was through that process, and we got a lot of reports, by the way, but it was through that process, I think it was my second year at uni then, we in 1973, and we got a report from a electronics technician at a place called Tyringham. He was living on a property there. And Tyringham, if you blink, you'd miss it. Basically, it was a little corner store. No corners actually in Tyringham. It was just a through road, but they called it the corner store. And during 1973, for some bizarre reason, it became the focus of a mini UFO flap. And it got very, very intense. And the flap endured and continued. And basically, it became my UFO baptism of fire. There was literally night after night, and it was kind of like gold for a early UFO researcher like me, because one of the things that you like, particularly if you've got a scientific bent like myself, you'd like to try and operate in an environment like the so-called repeatable experiment, i.e. one of the mainstays of the scientific method, and that is you didn't have to just rely on other people's UFO testimony. You could go along and witness it yourself and do it repeatedly. And this is what happened at Tyringham. For a period of a number of months, I was going backwards and forwards practically every weekend, investigating UFO sightings. And most of the time it was kept out of the media. And that was a good thing in many respects, because we developed a bond of trust with a lot of the locals. And it really was my own personal baptism of fire too, because when I arrived, the UFOs didn't go away. They were still there, and I was witnessing lights playing games, maneuvering over the nearby mountain called Boney Mountain, and seeing all sorts of strange things. And it got up close as well. We were seeing dish-shaped objects. And the crazy thing about this, and this has been repeated many, many times since by with researchers right around the world that have got involved with intense UFO flaps, and that is that whatever's involved, it seems to display an evasiveness that goes beyond mere chance. So that really got me into focusing on what to me was at the heart of the matter, trying to apply science to UFO sightings and being able to carry out what seemed to be a repeatable experiment. And I used to, how shall I say, borrow, steal, whatever equipment from the university faculties, and
As
talk to the yeah, as you do, yeah. Just get back on Monday in one piece, Bill. That'll be all good, No, what? By the way, what are you doing with it? Don't worry about it. It'll be all good. So, and as it was anyway, I got tutors, university lecturers, fellow students, others that joined me there during that period in 1973, and pretty much everyone who came with me saw something, and it was quite an amazing time. And that wave sort of petered out by about August, and it was during August actually that Dr. Alan Hynek, who most people who are at all interested in UFOs would know that Alan Hynek was the guy that came up with the term close encounters of the third kind. It was part of his category of UFO encounters. He was trying to try and bring order to what was a pretty complex phenomenon, and the categories of close encounters helped him to bring that sense of order to it. And that term emerged out of his 1971-72 book called The UFO Experience. And I really recommend that book to anybody who's at all seriously interested in the UFO field. You can access it via sites like, I think, Project 1947 or the NICAP website. They have free PDFs of Hynek's book. And it was essentially a solid scientist looking at the UFO phenomenon. And he had the benefit of being dragged into the UFO subject as early as 1947 and 48, and brought in as an official consultant to the United States Air Force. And pretty much he saw it very skeptically then. as a, I don't know, it'll as a temporary aberration that would disappear within a year, and that's the way it was seen at the time. But this didn't go away, and then he got heavily involved with it during Project Blue Book, and became one of the longest-serving scientific consultants to the United States Air Force until the Project Blue Book officially died and was closed in 1969. But as we all know, there were various projects that were conducted in a rather more stealthy way since then. So, so by that stage, by during the 70s, after I finished my science degree, I got a job working as a chemist through the TUI's organisation. Actually, it's one of the reasons why I went to University in England, because I won a science scholarship with them, and it gave me the opportunity to do, get sort of vacation work and all that kind of stuff. So it set me up fairly well, and also set me up with a job when I came to Sydney in 1975, and that's when I joined the local UFO group, UFOIC, UFO Investigation Centre. So that gets you through to at least 1975. So
Yeah, that's awesome. Just to give you a heads up, we might drop out here because I'm using the free version of Zoom at the moment, and I just had a 10-minute warning come up before, so we may drop out. But if that does happen, we'll get you back in there and hopefully continue on from there. So we'll wait and see what happens from that. So it'll be interesting. It's the first time it's happened to me so far. So, but either way. So just going back onto where you started reading into your books and stuff like that. Got some questions here for you. Someone's asking, were these early authors more rewriters than actual investigators?
no, a number of them were sort of.
Oh, there we go. We've lost it. Ta-da! We're back.
No freebies in this business.
No, it's not. It all costs bloody money to do this. And I'm too tight to go and pay for a Zoom membership. And so we'll crack back into that again, mate. We'll start again with that question there, because it's an awesome question. So, righto, here we go. All right, start again. So, were these early authors more rewriters than actual investigators?
There are a lot of hack writers. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you come through fine, mate. Yep.
Yep. Okay. So a lot of these early writers were kind of capturing a lot of media and write-ups in that way, but there were a number of researchers that were actually dealing with original material, and the likes of Donald Keogh and Edward Rolpole, who was the probably the better of the US Air Force investigators with Project Blue Book, particularly around 1952, 53. He published a book about flying saucers, and so you can get access to hardcore data through some of those types of writers, and others were starting to come onto the scene. But there was also a period where there were many, many books turning up, and a lot of it was, how shall I say, you could hear the trees screaming as they've been cut down to be used as paper to publish some of these early flying saucer books, and they weren't worth the paper that they were published on. But there were a lot of core UFO books, and there was a kind of a run of good writers and turning up, particularly, and even early journalists. The last few years, particularly since the New York Times story has come out, has seen quite a number of hardcore journalists sort of jumping into the subjects, like our own Ross Coulthard here doing a deep dive into the UFO subject here with his book and documentaries. And back during the 60s, there were some early journalists that were heavily into it. One of the key ones was John Fuller, and I certainly recommend his books. The first one he wrote was in 1965, Incident at Exeter, which basically attempted to document what was then a massive UFO wave right across America. And the following year, he came out with a much more controversial book called The Interrupted Journey, which was essentially the book that focused on the Betty and Barney Hill abduction story. So it was one of the first major abduction narratives that got serious mainstream coverage, and from that point on, there was a plethora of books turning up, and as I said earlier, one of the best of the early crop of books, as far as I'm concerned, was Dr. Alan Hynek's book from 1971-72, The UFO Experience. John Keel was very popular. Jacques Vallée came out with a number of books during the 60s, a couple that were strongly science-focused, Anatomy of a Phenomenon and Challenge to Science. And then he did a bit of a change of direction with probably one of the more controversial books, and that was Passport to Magonia, which essentially was drawing a connection between the flying saucer phenomena and I guess fairy lore or alternate folklore, and it was kind of an interesting sort of watershed book, and it caused a bit of a change of direction in terms of the focus of the more serious UFO investigators. And at the same time, John Keel was coming out with his book Operation Trojan Horse. I was reading that as an early book during my university years, and he brought in the concept of UFO windows and alternate views on what was going on here, and that it wasn't necessarily the extraterrestrial hypothesis at play. I was just being led by the data and what I found in terms of my field investigations. So by 1970, we were running a pretty active kind of UFO investigation scene in Sydney, and joining a lot of the other civilian groups around Australia. There were active UFO groups in Queensland and Victoria, South Australia, particularly Tasmania, and Western Australia, and indeed a couple of ad hoc groups in the Northern Territory as well. So we're covering the scene everywhere, and even the ACT was represented with a UFO group as well. And what we didn't know at the time was that there was a level of official interest and also a lot of secret official interest as well. Right throughout the history of the Australian UFO phenomenon, there's been this the perception that the official government examiner of UFOs or flying saucers or UFOs, or as they prefer to call them, UASs or unidentified aerial sightings rather than UAPs. It's a real word salad game here with the UFO subject these days. Now it's UAPs. But during that period, the RAAF was the official government examiner of the Royal Australian Air Force, Department of Defence, and they were that was the department that got the brief to study flying saucer UFO UAS reports. But meanwhile, there was a lot of secret activity going on behind closed doors as well. And the main key player, I got to. The government of the day actually said, and the Department of Defence said on a number of occasions, that members of the public could actually get access to some of the flying saucer reports just by contacting the RAAF, and they would be happy to share that data. Well, it didn't quite work out that way in reality. What it represented was that you would get, at best, heavily redacted reports and virtually bugger all detail. So it was essentially, yeah. So people like myself, we were sort of trying to be a lot more active and trying to get direct access. And lucky enough and amazing enough to me, I got my foot in the door in late 81, early 82. In January of 82, I had the first of what turned out to be 4 visits, and spread out over 2 years, in which I got to examine pretty much a continuous run of files. I don't think they were quite expecting a researcher like me to turn up on their doorstep at the Russell offices in Canberra. But I arrived on day one on the Monday. They soon turned up with 2 or 3 large mailbag type things full of files. And then said, go at it. And they lent me the office of the Director of Public Relations Office to have my file examination in there, and I could photocopy stuff at my leisure, which I thought was pretty amazing. And then about an hour later, they arrived again and said, sorry, we have to pull back these files because most of them weren't declassified at the time that I saw them. And so some poor bugger had to go through and stamp every single page declassified. And then they all came back. During that first hour, I thought there were going to be games, but I didn't expect that. And so I did a quick inventory during that first half hour to see exactly what I had, wrote down all the file names so that I could confirm that everything came back to me intact. And then they thought that would be it, that I would be happy and leave happy that day. But I arrived the Monday and left on the Friday. So I was there from 9 till 5 for 5 solid days going through all these files. And I eventually figured out that this was about a third of the case file, and spent a lot of my time focusing on the more interesting cases, but also on establishing a paper trail and writing down every file number series that I could lay my hands on. And then at the end of that process, I was then able to submit to them, okay, thank you very much for that file examination. Now I want to look at all these other files, and kept that process up for 2 years, two solid years. And through that process, I got to know of a gentleman by the name of Harry Turner. And it turned out that he had just retired himself. And I found out, I found reference to him in eventually in 1984 of actually 82, I think, of a report that he apparently had written. And this was, I found in a policy file. And this was a collation, an early study of the Daffy files. Now, Daffy, interesting term, but Daffy stands for Directorate of Air Force Intelligence. And back in 1954, they were being hammered by the government of the day because there were all these unexplained flying saucer sightings, and they wanted an explanation. And it just so happened at that time, there was this scientist, a nuclear physicist by the name of Harry Turner, who had official secret clearance, but he was doing nuclear research. He'd been to Harwell in England and been involved with the early days of radar establishment in Australia, and was a credentialed scientist, and at that time was at Melbourne University. And he asked to see if he could get access to the government files, which that was facilitated because it was like manna from heaven for the government, or for Air Force Intelligence, because here they could get an actual scientist to study the reports to see whether there was anything legitimate. They were hoping he'd come back and say it was all crap, rubbish. But he studied the reports and came back with a series of conclusions that weren't quite what they wanted. And that was that these reports represented possibly extraterrestrial craft, that we should be conducting a serious scientific examination. We should concentrate on radar cases, and that US Air Force data that he had access to, courtesy of Donald Keogh's best-selling book. He had published a book that had US Air Force case data on it, and those cases were full of unexplained cases, and US Air Force were conducting a bit of a vendetta campaign against Donald Keogh, arguing that he had inappropriately used Department of Defense data and that he was not to be trusted and that he was a science fiction writer. And this is the kind of stuff that the US Air Force were telling Australian authorities when they wanted to do their own due diligence and check with Washington authorities as to whether Turner's conclusions on Australian data supported by US data were legitimate. And because of that undermining of the US data, which in fact was legitimate UFO cases given to Donald Keogh by the United States Air Force, the Australian government decided not to pursue most of Harry Turner's key reports and key conclusions. And yet there we had it way back in 1954, long before our recent Pentagon reports and all the rest of it. Same sort of thing. Government scientists doing a scientific appreciation of the data and concluding that there was something definitely worthwhile looking at. And yet that he was shut down. And eventually he went off to England, came back, then became the chief scientist at the Maralinga bomb trials, where he was acting on behalf of the Australian government and was the chief health physics officer during these very controversial and rather notorious British atomic bomb trials. And there are actually reports during that period at Maralinga and also at Woomera, which he became privy to. And then eventually, by the end of the 60s, he had become head of the nuclear science section of the Director of Scientific and Technical Intelligence of the Joint Intelligence Organisation here in Australia. And from that position, he actually conducted his own UFO research on Joint Intelligence Organisation time. And that was confirmed to me by Harry Turner's boss, Bob Mathams, who was the first of the scientific intelligence analysts for the predecessor of the Joint Intelligence Organisation, and that was JIB. And Bob Mathams told me that, sure, I know you're after Harry Turner and I can help you find him, but I didn't exactly encourage him in this flying saucer work and his UFO obsession. But basically, because we needed his nuclear science expertise, they were prepared to tolerate that. And that's how we ended up having a secret UFO science war going on within the Joint Intelligence Organisation between the 1960s and early 70s, where Harry Turner was actively trying to advocate serious scientific investigations within the military intelligence regime. If you want to find out a little bit more about that, you can go to my blog, but also in New Dawn magazine, I've currently got an article in the current issue called Harry Turner and the Fight for UFO Science in Oz. So a very interesting guy, and he actively tried to pursue establishing a scientific investigation, and through him, I was able to track down quite a number of key government intelligence military scientists that were actively interested in the UFO subject, or actually going to join Harry in a rapid intervention team that was being set up, particularly under the auspices of the DSTO, the Defence Science and Technology Organisation that came into being during the early 70s. But basically, that all came to a grinding halt because of a lot of somewhat petty politicking that went on, and basically that early attempt at UFO science within our own government and military intelligence establishment sort of came to nothing, particularly after Harry had retired. He was the main primary driver of it. But I had people as high as Dr. John Farrens, who was the chief defence scientist. I was told that he had an active interest in UFO reports. I thought, what the hell, I'll give him a call. He'd just recently retired, written a book, not about UFOs, but about the uses and abuses of science. And I fully expected to get a bit of a difficult hearing from him, but he was quite friendly. In actual fact, had his own copies of government UFO files within his hand's reach, and he was able to give me basically detailed file references to things that I should pursue. And he said that he was even thinking of writing his own UFO book, but in the end didn't, and said he'd wait for mine to appear, and that was in 1996. And it came out during July, but unfortunately, John Farrens passed away in July, a few weeks after my book came out, so which was kind of sad. But he definitely had an active interest in the UFO subject as well. So there was a lot going on, and a lot of secret activity, but also a lot of civilian activity. And really, I think I've got to put a positive thing out here for civilian groups around Australia and around the world, that without those groups sort of carrying the torch, we wouldn't be in the position that we are today, where there appears to be a massively increasing interest in UFOs, or UAPs, to give it the current term.
Yeah, you'd think with all these groups and that coming out, and with obviously the government coming out with their own disclosure, like the US government particularly, that it'd be taken a lot more serious around the world, but yet it still has this bit of a stigma attached to it. And it's like, why is that still there? Even though the governments and all these groups are coming out, giving this
Well,
bit of evidence and such.
well, there's a long history here, and I'd certainly recommend people who are keen to pursue this angle to uh, have a look at Ross Coulthard's book, In Plain Sight, and a number of other books that get into this area to try to dig down to it. But I got involved with a book that was put together by what was called the UFO History Group. This was a group that included me here in Australia and a number of active researchers in the United States that were interested in the science and the history in great depth. And a book was published called UFO'S in Government, and I can't recommend that highly enough. It's a massive study of the efforts of government to either bury or study UFOs over the decades. And there were quite a number of authors, but the key authors were Dr. Michael Swords and Robert Powell. And Robert Powell has gone on to create a new group. He was originally the science director for the MUFON organisation, but felt that he couldn't do the kind of science that he was trying to do, and formed the SCU, which was initially called the Scientific Coalition of UFO researchers, but because of the popularization of the UAP term, it became the SCU again, the Scientific Coalition of UAP researchers. Now, I can understand the transition to that more neutral term, but to me, it kind of also sort of avoids poking at the elephant in the room, so to speak. There's this massive UFO phenomenon that's far stranger than just objects flying around the sky. There's a lot of quite extraordinary things going on.
Yeah, there is. There's a lot of things going around. There's obviously there's like a lot of things that do get explained away, like mistaken a lot. But there are those big hard ones there that are fully questionable that you can't explain, and like they're the ones you're supposed to be taking more serious than anything. But yet it doesn't seem to get the limelight that it deserves.
Yeah, well, a lot of people sort of talk about December 2017 as being the turning point, because that's when the New York Times came out with their kind of breakthrough news report, which highlighted the existence of a secret Pentagon program, ATIP, but that was a bit of a mistake at that time. It was actually something, yet another piece of word salad, ORSAP, which in fact was a Defense Intelligence Agency initiated project that had more of a stronger focus on the notorious Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. And it was not only studying UFOs or UAPs, but also studying the wider dimensions of the UFO phenomenon that people like myself were quite well aware of for decades, and that was the rather stranger dimensions of it, the what, for want of a better term, we would call paranormal. And just recently, there was a really good book published in 2005, I think, Hunt with a Skinwalker, and that was put together by George Knapp and Cole Kellan. It was the initial look at what was going on the Skinwalker Ranch. But just this year, there's been a publication by those two authors, but they were joined by the key player that initiated the Defense Intelligence Agency involvement in the Skinwalker Ranch and more broadly in the UAP phenomenon. That was Dr. James Lakatsky. And amazingly for him, he'd never had what he regarded as any sort of paranormal experience, yet within 2 hours of turning up on the Skinwalker Ranch, because he had read the book, the earlier book, and thought we should really look at this because there might be some sort of threat aspect to it. And he was a government scientist, mainly into missiles and propulsion, that kind of thing. But then he arrives at the ranch. He's there with the then owner, Robert Bigelow, and Cole Kellener, and we're in the one of the buildings there, and then has what appeared to be a kind of an extraordinary experience of seeing a rotating thing. And if anybody's familiar with records, check out the cover of Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield. It shows a little kind of metallic pipe-looking thing, a peculiar shape, and that's what he saw hovering inside the house and only he could see it. And he didn't describe that to the people around him, but he knew straight away there and then that there was something quite bizarre going on. If he could manipulate his mind, his perception, and create that kind of effect on him after just 2 hours on the property, he thought there's something really worthwhile looking into. And so he managed to get funding to subsidise a combined investigation by Bigelow's organisation, BAS, and the Defence Intelligence Agency. And most of the key defence military people that came from DIA all had strange experiences almost immediately whenever they were on the ranch. Now, a lot of that's described in passing detail in this new book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, rather somewhat lurid title, but it's a really worthwhile book getting your teeth into. I described some of the correlations between what the DIA people were encountering at Skinwalker and my own experiences back on the Dorrigo Plateau at Tyringham way back in '73. We were experiencing very similar phenomena. And even Harry Turner encountered accounts from people within the Canberra area that he was studying on, once again, JIA time, that correlated with things that the DIA people were encountering. And they also had this bizarre aspect of what was referred to as the hitchhiker effect. Now, that can be given all sorts of different terms. And if you spread your net broadly enough, you can correlate that term with the kind of strange effects that occur in all sorts of paranormal type phenomena. Now, it sort of begs the question that we really should be looking at the UFO phenomenon very broadly, much more broadly than the new Pentagon agency will be doing, and that is focusing on cases that are in strictly military domains. And part of the problem with all the decades that I've been involved, I've been advocating serious open inquiry from science and dedicated researchers, always trying to make it open and broadly available for everybody. And yet we seem to be turning the other way, where it's becoming now a very skewed kind of almost secretive investigation yet again. And we really don't need to have yet another kind of Project Blue Book thing that sort of says something publicly, but all the good stuff is being kept confidential and classified. So we'll wait and see. But certainly the publicity over the last few years has generated all sorts of more mainstream and more public kind of responses, like Project Galileo through Harvard University with Arie Loeb. It'll be interesting to see how all that plays out. And there's been numerous other interesting manifestations as well. So it seems to be a very interesting time. There's less debunking going on, less ridicule, but as you point out, that's still there. It's still hard for people to report, mainly because most reports are anecdotal. It's based on the word of the individual, and very hard to come out and put, it's a hard thing to decide whether you want to go public with a lot of reports and that kind of stuff. But that makes it more difficult for investigation and research. And there's got to be a middle ground where there's an environment in which credible cases can be researched and people can carefully and bring out their own experiences, particularly those that are extraordinarily compelling. And I know with the decades that I've been involved with, that's been a pretty difficult thing for a lot of people. And, I honour a lot of the people that have talked to me over the decades. I've talked to thousands of people, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them that are incredibly compelling witnesses. And I admire their courage in coming forward.
It's incredible what's been progressed over the years, and it's to me, I sort of feel like it needs to get that sort of outsourced sort of thing, like sort of like what the Two to Stars Academy sort of did. They're also a bit behind closed doors with some of the stuff they did, but I sort of feel like with all these experiences that the military, or even just like getting things that are getting reported to the military or any sort of government forms, I sort of feel it needs to be outsourced to other companies or organisations to go and really throw into this and go dive deeper than take up the time of what the military officers or investigators, Instead of taking up their time, why not get the other organisations out there to go and do the dirty work for them, basically?
I don't know whether I'd call it dirty work, but I think there's certainly a field that really screams out for multidisciplinary inquiry, etc. And there's a hell of a lot that can be done in the public domain, in the public science sphere. And what's encouraged me is that it seems to be a narrowing of the barrier. The full-throated kind of debunking skeptics that you used to see back a few decades ago, and still a bit today, they're becoming, their foundations are becoming pretty rocky and very flimsy, and they're finding it harder and harder to cope with the kind of cases that are being presented to them or they're finding out about. I think they're starting to realise that there's something compelling to all this UFO data. That maybe the crazy UFO people and the UFO researchers were actually onto something that they're way behind the eight ball on, and they're busily struggling to catch up now. And perhaps are thinking, well, maybe we shouldn't have really killed that witness. We shouldn't have, there may have been compelling data there, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of that going on, a lot of catch up. And I think that catch up process should involve a serious kind of coordination of those that have done the hard yards, compelling witnesses over the decades, the historical research, the data that's been gathered by civilian UFO groups, all that kind of thing. All of that should be brought into play in terms of both calibrating the current attempts to do things. It's kind of like everybody's jumping in, saying, move along, step to one side, we're taking over now. But most of those people don't seem to understand the dimensions of the phenomena that's been going on for decades. Most of this, there's nothing new. It's all been done before. It's all been said before. It's all been researched before. And yet it's all being presented as brand new discoveries. I guess the best thing about what's happening now, particularly with the military data, is that it's full of multi-sensory data. And that's what makes it even more compelling. But that multi-sensory data does exist in various forms going back decades. The radar visual cases over the decades and all sorts of other types of compelling cases. So there's a rich database there that's existed for decades. And that UFO corpse that was dead and buried in 1969 is still thrashed around out there, and it's still reoccurring, and it's still upsetting a lot of people that come into a bit of a close encounter with it as well over the decades.
It is, and I think it's going to continue that way too. It's never going to stop until we actually do finally get that massive disclosure that everyone's been waiting for. So until then, the mystery is going to continue.
Yeah. I personally really couldn't give a stuff about disclosure. Basically, I think there's been disclosure on for decades, and there's really lots of data out there already, more than enough to carry on serious kind of open investigations and active field investigations. Like we don't have to wait for the government military to conduct their own private inquiries and come to their conclusions and rely on their data. That time is well and truly past. There are many amazing kind of initiatives that have been carried out over the decades that we're starting to get marched out again through the background of solid history. But there's also major initiatives going on right now that are not in the military domain, not in the government domain, and they're the kind of things that we should be looking at, not waiting for some precious kind of disclosure that'll maybe come out through government. I think the so-called elephant's already bolted through the door, and I think there's a lot of massive catch-up going on. It's not a phenomenon that's unique to military intelligence. It's a phenomenon that's being experienced by, literally hundreds of thousands of people right around the world, and it really deserves to be examined openly, not through military intelligence and restrictions there. I can understand the so-called threat analysis, that kind of stuff, but if there was a threat going on, well, it would have manifested decades earlier. And really the main priority, I guess, is that they want a piece of the action. They want this technology, and they want it now, and they want it to look after their own defence technology, not be sort of outgunned by other people. So it's a pity that threat analysis still seems to manifest, but there's a lot that can be done in the public domain.
Yeah, I think more my reasoning for the disclosure side of things is more so like the people who have experienced something and have been ridiculed over all these years, it's just so they can go back at the people who don't believe and who ridiculed and just go, haha, in your face kind of thing. And
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
that's
I can
that's
get,
sort
I
of
can
what we
get
want.
that. Yeah, yeah.
So we
But
are going to get the timer up again, so it's going to cut out on us in another 6 minutes. So I think we might just go and do a quick little shutdown of this and get you back in again, and this will be the last little segment we'll do for the half hour. So
okay,
just give us a minute there, guys. We're going to go and get this back going again because thankfully we're using the free time of Zoom again. So give us a minute there, guys. We'll get Bill back in again, so just bear with us. So, mate, I want to. Someone has asked here too, and I want to get on this one as well. So, someone has asked, what has to be the most memorable personal experience in witnessing your UFO? So, yeah, basically, what's your most? I suppose you would have had to experience something yourself, wouldn't you?
yes, indeed, yeah, Churiam for starters, and back in '73, that was quite confronting. So, probably, I guess in terms of rattling my cage, so to speak, probably the year before. You know, I described earlier all that sort of stuff happening on the Dorrigo Plateau at Turingham and dragging people down and witnessing all sorts of phenomena. You know, that really made it very, very real. But the year before, in 1973, and I think September, I think thereabouts, 1972, I'm doing chemistry, and I remember it was I just finished a chemistry practical class, and they went 4 solid hours where you're doing chemistry experiments and whatever. And once you finished them, the high priority was to get down that bloody hill and get to the cafeteria before it closed in your college, so you could have dinner. And so I'm tearing down the hill, running across the quadrangle just to get in there to get the last of the food that was about to close in the canteen. And I see 2 students walking across the quadrangle, and male and female. I kind of vaguely knew them. And the guy's looking up, and the girl's saying to him, you see what I see? And he says, yeah, but I don't want to. And I thought, what the hell are they on about? And I'm looking up. I looked away from them to look in the direction what they're looking at. And I look up and I see it was just coming up to twilight. So still a lot of daylight around. I looked above the building of the campus, Elvage College, and I see literally, I suppose, God, everybody is into Tic Tacs, but yeah, this was an egg-shaped, silvery metallic looking thing flying slowly across above the campus building. And it seemed very solid and quite sizable in terms of relative dimensions. Now, here am I, by that stage, I'd done a lot of investigations and that kind of stuff. So I had an idea of what I was doing basically. And I thought, this is unreal. You know, like I'm seeing if it's around about 200 to 300 feet as to what my intuitive perceptions were suggesting, this thing was about 30 to 40 feet in diameter, you know, quite large. If it was any higher, it would have been huge. And it wasn't undulating, or it was very steady in terms of its flight. So it appeared to give the impression of being a large object, a large solid object. And I could see that it was tracking above the building. And I knew that between me and open sports field behind, through a narrow laundry section of the side building, I could run through there and get a continuous observation of the object. And if it was a balloon, and that certainly didn't seem likely, I'd be able to see it. And I rushed through in a matter of seconds, nothing there. So I had huge playing field exposure and could see nothing. I ran back through again, nothing there. Earlier in the day, I did investigate that, obviously with airport authorities and everybody I could think of. I couldn't come up with an explanation. And earlier in the day, I'd have been approached by a chap that knew me. And in those days, I'd actually become part of the committee of the University of New England Parapsychological Society. You know, we're into paranormal research back in the 70s. Now, so being there, done that, that's what I keep saying, you know, in terms of all this current obsession with UFOs and paranormal. There were people doing that for decades. And what he reported to me, which he thought would have been of interest to me, was that he said that there was apparition phenomena witnessed on a property just on the outskirts of Armidale, a place called Mount Butler, early in the same morning. So here am I having what essentially was a daylight disc sighting, a silvery metallic object going over the campus, and people were reporting to me an apparitional sighting on a property just outside of the town earlier that morning, and it involved an apparitional thing like a ghost of a monk, a shroud with a dark void of a face, and it was a very bizarre case. And I eventually investigated that, and that Mount Butler location became the focus of ongoing UFO activity, more physical craft being seen, some really interesting correlations with other events. And so it was yet another one of these window areas, but it was a very striking confirmation for me just how strange the UFO or UAP phenomena can become. Because the Mount Butler area and my own personal daylight disc sighting confirmed to me that there was something incredibly strange going on. And outside of Armidale, particularly at Mount Butler, was another one of these, for want of a better word, window area, whatever, the current buzzwords, portals, or God knows what else. But there's all sorts of variants on the titles that people give to them. But Mount Butler became a focus for unusual activity. And people have approached me since then and have told me that from time to time there's been ongoing activity there. But I have noticed that that area has now been built out well and truly. It's almost like suburbia out there on the outskirts of Armidale. So it's no longer the remote area. And also, additionally, it doesn't seem to have one of the interesting areas that actually correlated somewhat with an event that took place on the other side of Australia. And that's the Northwest Cape sighting, occurred almost in the same time. You can see an account I give of this, the comparison between the two on my blog site, where I compare Northwest Cape to Mount Butler in 1973. Both sites had different frequencies involved with ground stations. The one at Armidale, outside of Armidale, involved ionosphere atmospheric research, and they were bouncing radio waves off the ionosphere at a certain frequency. Over in Western Australia with Northwest Cape, they were using very, very low frequencies for their communications with the US submarines, that kind of stuff. So somewhere on that spectrum, there's a lot of interesting UFO phenomena correlated with the frequencies that are within that spectral range. So yet again, another area of promising study that a lot of people are trying to focus on right now. And that was evident back in 1973. And more recently, other sources have suggested that those frequencies are of particular interest when it comes to tracking UFO phenomena and maybe bagging UFO phenomena as well, or UAP phenomena. And we would all like to bag one for sure.
So, oh, absolutely. Wouldn't we what? So how did you feel when you sort of experienced that UFO? Like how long were you sort of investigating into this sort of thing and then just realised like you're actually seeing something?
Well, I got to admit that particular week I was incredibly jaded about UFOs and flying saucers because back in the Big Smoke in Sydney, there were front page stories going on with a UFO sighting at Taree day after day, early morning, 7:10. Front page newspaper story in the Daily Mirror. I was loving it, day after day, hundreds of people. But as it turned out, I'd gone to the trouble of checking out myself, and I was absolutely certain that what people were watching was the Queen of UFO misidentification, Venus. And I got up, and it was pretty rare for me to get up very early at that time with the university life. So getting up at 7:10 was a real struggle, but I was coherent at the time, and we all did predictive studies of it, and we confirmed that, yes, what people were seeing at Taree was Venus. And so I was pretty jaded with UFOs that week because it was all about identified flying objects, and eventually the Mirror and the Sun newspapers, these were afternoon newspapers, finally concluded that it was probably Venice, and that explanation came out in a little story about 20 pages in, rather than the front page story over the preceding day. So and so it was quite a shock for me to have that sighting of my own. I thought, whoa, what's going on here? And it wasn't what I was expecting. I certainly did not have that on my mind when I was walking across the quadrangle. The primary motivation in my mind was food. Get into that canteen and get some food. That's it. That was it.
That's fair enough.
I didn't get dinner that night. So,
oh.
Yeah, that was a real sort of sacrifice for me in terms of UFO investigation. So.
Yeah, and so no doubt you've obviously had some more encounters, obviously, in the future or after that one.
Yeah, not so much in the future. I'm not there yet, but but certainly over the intervening decades, been lots of interesting experiences and that kind of stuff that I've had under very interesting kind of circumstances, and that would require a lot more time to describe a lot of that.
I was thinking the same thing too.
Yeah, this subject has taken me all over the world and investigated cases in practically every state of Australia, New Zealand, been in New Guinea, been up through Asia, particularly spent a lot of time in Thailand and China, been to the States, lectured there, lectured twice at 2 different Chinese universities about the UFO subject. If I was invited to go now, I wouldn't necessarily go back in a rush to China. It doesn't seem as though Australians in particular are welcome there at the moment.
Well, let alone the rest of the world.
Yeah. So so it's certainly been an interesting number of decades, and I've got no shadow of a doubt that there's something real going on that deserves investigation. And my big sort of thing that I focus on is open, scientific, transparent investigations, not kind of secret military intelligence investigation. That's got to happen up to a certain extent, because there's always some suggestion that there's, I guess, nuclear threat connections, all that kind of stuff. That's been going on for decades, and it's interesting to see that they're finally paying open attention to it as well, in terms of the Congress trying to mandate a study group specifically on that area.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're supposed to get something in April too, aren't we? Another document.
Yeah. I'll join the crowd waiting for that. But, no, I was kind of. It was hard to get too enthusiastic about the report last year, but I'm saying, okay, this is good. Where's the detail?
It's a start.
Data, mate. Data. That's what we're after, and we didn't get it, of course. Yeah.
No, definitely. Mate, so we're getting towards the end of the show there. So we're going to smash through these questions that people have been hanging to ask you. First one here is, what constitutes a legit report in your opinion? Number of witnesses, hour of the day, length, physical evidence, etc.?
Because of my scientific background, I tend to focus on a lot of physical evidence type cases, and I've been known to have a strong focus on UFO landing cases over the decades. So I'm a real enthusiast for that kind of UFO landing case where physical traces are left on the ground or whatever environment they turn up in. The trouble with that is it's been somewhat diluted by the obsession with crop circles and that kind of thing. And a friend of mine, Dr. Horace Drew, who helped me out on biological DNA research and abduction case, the one that involved Peter Curie, in which I wrote the book Here of the Alien, he's developed quite an obsession with that kind of area. And given what I know of his pathway to that obsession with crop circles, I perfectly understand why he's become obsessed with crop circles. But he and I, like a lot of scientists do, we agree to argue, and scientists argue all the bloody time, and we disagree a lot of the time as well. And so that's the nature of the scientific game. We're looking for hard evidence to confirm people's hypotheses about what's going on. To me, I'm fairly skeptical about crop circles. Horace isn't. So, but plenty of long conversations and arguments about crop circles. But as far as his specialty about DNA, he and the team we put together mounted a really good, I think, investigation of Peter Curie's alien, so-called alien abduction case. The fact that we had a biological sample, physical evidence, and investigations require a lot of time, a lot of effort. They're not done in a day. They're not, like Peter Curie's case. Peter knows it too. It's still ongoing. We've been at it for decades. There's stuff still happening. I got to know Peter back in the late '80s, and so we started to mount a serious investigation by the not the late '80s, early '90s rather. And but he had an experience in '88, and then the most interesting one for me personally was the '92 experience that led to the hair sample, and that was so interesting and so confronting that I had sort of a division of Simon & Schuster in New York contacting me, wanting me to write a book about it. I didn't have to present a manuscript. They wanted one. So that was based on some of the preliminary reporting we did. So that was a fairly easy one to do. But to me, that was one of the more interesting investigations because it involved credible witness, one that was willing to lay all his cards on the table, and looked at the good, bad, and the ugly of the whole story, and out of it came physical evidence that seemed to support the idea that he had something quite extraordinary happening to him. It's not proof of aliens in its own right. As a scientist, we'd want to have literally hundreds of these sorts of samples, and that was the reason why I wrote the book Here of the Alien, was to provide a kind of a line for researchers and investigators and experiencers to realise that in order to make progress in these controversial areas, you need to at least be able to present kind of credible evidence. It can't be all just anecdotal. I know that there's a lot of reluctance with some people to report their experiences, but it'll always be a kind of a fringe subject, particularly the more controversial aspects of it, like abductions and contact experiences. There's been a huge opening up of investigations of objects, UAPs, UFOs, whatever you want to call them, but it's still narrowly focused, and it's a bit of a acknowledgement that, some paranormal aspects have to be examined. But when it comes to the controversial contact cases and abduction cases, they've got a much more difficult road to travel. And I understand why a lot of those groups have become, a lot of the people involved that tended to gather together and support themselves and that kind of stuff like that. But I think Peter Curie's case was important because it did highlight that there is so much that can be done. And that case, to me, was a really excellent case study of what can be done if we deploy the right sort of investigations, research, equipment, studies, scientific testing, that kind of thing. And if there were hundreds of cases like that, well, great. We'd be so much more advanced. And maybe there are cases like that that exist in the secret defence intelligence world. Who knows? We're not seeing much evidence for it, but there's a lot that can be done in the public eye.
Yep, no, that's fair enough.
That's what why people should think about sort of sharing their experiences with serious investigators. I know there's a lot of people out there that get worried about reporting their experiences. Who do they report them to? But I think in this day and age, with the benefit of the internet and all that kind of stuff, you can do a lot of homework. And I really encourage people that have had experiences that they're really trying to figure out where they should report them. They should shop around and get comfortable with the people that they want to report these experiences to, and think about making their experiences more publicly available, because there are groups out there that have the resources to do serious investigations, and that's what I would encourage people to do.
Yeah, no, it's a great bit of a great tip there on for people who want to bring out their sightings or experiences and stuff like that. Like, because definitely need to encourage those sort of people to come forward, and
Yeah.
they're the ones that are actually help bring out the full disclosure, not the government themselves.
Yeah.
People that
But,
are experiencing these
yeah,
things.
yeah, I've been focusing on cases that go back 100 years or more. Like one of my primary hobby horses is studying pre-1947 cases, and there's a case there at Parramatta Park that I've probably talked far too much about, but I'm sort of working on something substantial on that, because there's so much that's come out on that story, a story that happened over 150 years ago, which is either a UFO case or it's a case of an early aviation visionary that somehow imagined he saw a flying arc land in Parramatta Park and gets taken on board. Quite a striking case, 1868, and he had a whole series of experiences that follow. Another one in 1927 at Fernvale up near Moorlambar, country New South Wales. You look at that report, and I got it from a guy and his sister. He was 10, she was, I think, 7 or 8 at the time, and they reported that to me. I investigated that over recent decades, and that was like a New South Wales Australian version of the Mothman prophecies, literally almost prophesizing what would take place in West Virginia in 1966-67. It was such a striking early historical case, really weird. UFO sightings, entities, animal mutilations, all that kind of stuff. It was just a truly strange report, and that was from 1927, where I was able to actually talk to the actual witnesses that lived long enough to tell me the full story.
Wow.
There's a lot of data out there. It's not just something that's happened since 1947, and it's certainly not something that's happened over the last few years. It's been ongoing worldwide for decades.
Well, even hundreds of years, thousands of years even.
Yeah. Well, who knows? Yeah.
Well, you got the ancient hieroglyphs and all sorts of stuff, Aztecs and all sorts of stuff. They've got to have some sort of god that they base themselves off, and that's
that's a difficult and problematical area. The old ancient astronauts thing, it tends to draw all sorts of critiquing from the skeptics and debunkers. But I've talked to many Aboriginals here in Australia, and talked to some elders on a lot of going back many years, and they've described to me all sorts of striking cases. Even a UFO crash out the back of Burke, in 1969, on the same day as the moon landing. Hundreds of people, hundreds of school kids, and a couple of Catholic priests and nuns witnessed an object rising up, almost like a mushroom cloud below it, and apparently it crashed, and subsequently some strange debris was found. But for anybody who knows what that area is like, unfortunately, it's subject to massive, slow-moving floods. Whenever it does flood, more often than not, it's pretty hot and dry out there. But when it floods, there's a lot of earth moving going on out there, unfortunately, and we were never able to establish an absolute location of that debris.
Bugger, so good luck trying to find it.
Yeah, but getting there and talking to locals and getting their confidence, we were able to establish that so many people within the Aboriginal community had hidden experiences that they wouldn't share with anybody unless they had some sort of contact with sort of elders and that kind of stuff. And we were able to break through that kind of barrier and get a lot of their stories. And it was really striking. And that's occurred in a number of different locations in the Kimberleys and up in far north Queensland and New South Wales and other locations as well. So it's not just so-called Caucasian white experience. It's something that Aboriginals, our first Australians, have experienced as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a quick one on the, you were mentioning before about your case that you studied there, or investigated, I should say, where you actually got a sample there. Someone's thrown a quick question in there asking if it was the sample that identified as a Homo sapien Asian lineage?
The hair sample itself seemed to finally give a constellation of DNA results that suggested we're dealing with a hybrid type sample. Depending on where you took the DNA from, you'd either get an Asian Mongoloid, rare Asian Mongoloid DNA, or if you took it from the root of the hair, you got a different constellation of DNA results, and that was rare Barth Gaelic DNA. And it was the Lahu Asian correlation that actually encouraged me to go to Asia, and particularly to northern Thailand and southern China, to actually investigate why there were aspects of Lahu DNA turning up in a blonde hair sample, what appeared to be a blonde hair sample taken from a person claiming to have had an abduction experience here in Sydney. And that was a very bizarre mystery. And the investigations we conducted in northern Thailand and southern China really added to that. And extraordinarily enough, while we're in Lahu territory in southern China in Yunnan province, this would have been 2005 or 6. You can read the details on the blog, but within 1 or 2 weeks of being there, I wished I'd hung around another few weeks, there was a UFO wave in that area of Yunnan province. So it was pretty striking, and that was in Lahu territory.
Yeah, okay. So I'm just out of my own curiosity, like, there wasn't any traces, like, I'm not sure if you can actually trace it, but, like, the rarity, like, the gene mutates a little bit, like, for, I suppose, mutant, becoming a mutant is a horrible way to call it, but, like, albino, like, was it traces of, like, albinoism or something like that?
There was no albinoism in the sample. It appeared to be optically transparent, but there was this Asian Mongoloid DNA which suggested it should have been dark coloured, black, but it was optically transparent. Very unusual hair sample. Even when we examined it under the microscope, it seemed unusual. And it was that early data that we published that led to us getting a bit of limited funding, private funding, that allowed us to take it steps further. Unfortunately, a lot of this kind of stuff can be fairly expensive. It's not something that can be done on the cheap. Actually, there's a lot we could have done if DNA testing had been cheaper back in the day, but we took it as far as we could, and there's still some samples left, and people contact us all the time wanting us to hand over the remains of the sample, but we're not about to do that unless we can get absolute confirmation that we're dealing with a fairly credible kind of protocol or strategy for investigating what remains of a largely compromised sample. So it's an important sample, and we don't get many of them, despite the fact that I've asked most of the key abduction researchers of the day to come forward with their samples, and they weren't too forthcoming. So
yeah, I suppose a lot of the samples would get destroyed in the process too, wouldn't they?
Some of the testing, there's lots more advanced testing that can be done now, but we're dealing with basically only remnants of the original quality sample. And even when we first got our hands onto it, we regarded it as a compromised sample in the sense that it was degraded. So we're constantly dismayed that we managed to get so much out of such a small sample. And I showed you the power of the technique, and that's why I promoted the approach that let's do a forensic approach on these sort of cases. Like if all these abduction experiences are occurring in the manner that people are describing, it suggests that there's some sort of contact going on, forensic style contact, and every contact leaves a trace, and that trace we should be able to find. And we've got the power of various techniques now with DNA investigations and DNA research tools right now to verify that claim, but unfortunately not many people sort of came forward. We did investigate a lot of cases, even in the Betty and Barney Hill case, the dress involved in that case. We were able to deploy DNA testing on that, and we were able to verify that in fact the pink stain that was on the dress was spider's blood indigenous to the New Hampshire area. And that demonstrated the power of the technique. It was, wow. She apparently must have sat on a poor spider out there in the bushland, and that caused the pink stain. But there are other aspects of that early investigation that we didn't realise at the time that suggested that there were possible correlations with Hmong DNA. That's only really resurfaced in the last year or so. Now, because that was only a trace result, we're a little bit sort of ambivalent about what it means. But the important thing for me is that the Lahu, which we did correlate with Peter Curry's hair sample, and the Hmong DNA that was found on Betty Hill's dress, they're closely connected in the tribal areas in the so-called Golden Triangle, northern Thailand, and southwest China, in that sort of area there, and it may be purely a phantom finding that doesn't have too much substance, but it's interesting enough to go further with that. If there was Hmong trace DNA. Now, one of the explanations is that maybe it was a Hmong sort of dry cleaner on the dress, that kind of stuff, because Hmong were let into America after the Vietnam War. But the information that I've got from the people who have had access to the dress suggests that it hadn't been dry cleaned. So you have to explain why there's a trace of Hmong DNA on there. So even now, there's still strange aspects to this case.
Everywhere though, things sort of.
So that gives you an idea. Like this is a case study that's had such vast dimensions to it that it's really quite amazing.
Yeah, the fact that you actually had evidence as well is phenomenal on its own basis, really. To go and sort of help along with a lot of cases.
It was strong enough to make me rethink my attitudes to alien abduction stories, put it that way.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Look, we're sort of running out of time because the Zoom bloody alarms come up again, so we've got about 8 minutes to go and smash through some more questions here. So unfortunately, we can't keep going with this, otherwise it's going to be a very long show. So, all right, so next one. What are your thoughts on Stephen Greer? He has been trying to disclose UFO information for decades, so I guess what's your opinion on him?
Yeah, better that I don't disclose anything. My comments there speak for itself. Like, I admire what the guy has done in certain areas, but what he's achieved, other people have achieved the same sort of stuff.
So he's basically taking credit for the things that people have done in the past there.
Well, I'm not going to go down that path. This is such a litigious subject that, I don't want to say too much.
No, fair enough. All right, we'll go and smash on the next one there. If I can quickly find it. Someone's asked there, why do you think the government is giving us such soft disclosure?
Well, it depends on how you look at it and where you look. Some of it's been very hard disclosure. Like, I was dismayed to find a defence scientist within our own government who was doing almost full-time UFO research on JOB time. It wasn't sanctioned UFO research. His own boss was trying to stop him doing it, but he's a guy who had almost unique nuclear science expertise, and so they had to keep him, and so they had to tolerate his UFO interests. And he was, for a long, long time, trying to advocate serious scientific investigations within military intelligence and military science, and almost succeeded. But there was too much politicking going on. But now here we go around the merry-go-round yet again, and we might be seeing evidence of similar activities occurring right now and being promised to Congress. So maybe we'll have another round of the merry-go-round yet again.
Yeah.
But there's a lot out there. There's a lot of information out there. So I've always been an advocate of public UFO data, and really a little tired of waiting for the government of the days or the military of the days to reveal their data, because so much of it's already been revealed. So, I'll love it when I see it.
Yep, no, fair enough. So next question is, do you think or know that the Aussie government has at any time had exotic material in the possession, be that recovered or on loan from other nations to study?
I'll be circumspect there, because there's a lot of interesting developments that I've been privy to that I might be able to describe in more detail at a later date. But yeah, there's some interesting things that I've been told about from a number of diverse parties, and in particular a few key people. And so, stay tuned.
Yeah, definitely. We'll definitely get you on the show again, mate, because we've got a lot to cover with your history of this whole investigations and researching, mate. I think it's just a big wormhole, really, that we'll be diving into, I think.
Yeah. Indeed.
So, look, mate, I think we'll end it there. I can't really see any more questions that are coming through. Hang on. Here's one. In your opinion, where is the best spot in Australia and times to see these crafts, do you think?
It varies. Different places around Australia have long histories associated with UFO activity. Far North Queensland, Tully, that's got a long history. Areas around the Gold Coast, Queensland, St. George, Queensland. I'll just quickly roam around Australia. Take a UFO tour job. Maybe I should become a UFO tourist guide.
You make a killing.
Yeah, it would be good. Yeah, but wait till COVID's done. But New South Wales, North Coast, as I've said, that whole area, the North Coast, particularly around Kempsey, around my little hometown Grafton, Armidale, Mount Butler, out at Birkway, Warriner. Virtually, the list is endless. You go right down to the south coast, areas around Nowra and the southern area around there, loaded with so many sightings, some very striking sightings as well. Victoria's had plenty of areas, with our famous report from Westall, happening in the suburbs, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
There's so many areas, and Tasmania's had a very rich UFO history, really brilliantly sort of collected by the civilian group of the day, the TUFOIC, the Tasmanian UFO Investigation Centre, areas around Medina, Devonport, particularly Highland area, place that was euphemistically called Highland Farm in central Tasmania. I went up there and checked that one out myself as well. Amazing area with ongoing phenomena there. South Australia, plenty of phenomena there, plenty of sightings there. And in terms of government investigations, the Woomera test site was not only a test site for man-made activity, there was such a rich history of UFO activity there. Something else was going on there, watching them doing their big science thing. So somebody else's big science was observing our big science as well, out at the Woomera area and also at Maralinga. And the same goes for the Northern Territory. Heaps of areas there, Pine Creek, good old Pine Gap area, many reports from there, up through Darwin, Western Australia, so many areas there, it's staggering. I helped out a scientific team do an investigation of light phenomena that was occurring in the Kimberleys, and they actually recorded some stuff, but we had to get permission from the local Aborigines to access that site, but it was a recurring area there as well, right down through Western Australia. And of course, my mate Ross Coltart has done a good job of providing a renewed focus on Northwest Cape. Certainly needed it, and the area around Northwest Cape, Exmouth and Ningaloo Reef, all those areas around there have exceptional UFO activity, and I could go on and on and on. So, but it's hard to get a handle on the frequency and guaranteeing a sighting. There are areas that are ongoing, and you just have to pay attention.
Yeah, I sort of feel it's right place, right time for a lot of people. Because like some people say, yeah, it's a hotspot for sure. Then someone will go there and go, I saw nothing. So it's like, how's this a hotspot?
Yeah. But there are lots of people, and actually there are some individuals, and we have our own share of them here, that seem to attract UFO activity as well. So they're interesting people to check out and maybe make good friends with, because if they become the focus of UFO activity, it's worthwhile accompanying them on their activities and see what you see yourself as well.
Definitely. Well, mate, we've got to end it there, mate, so I think we've got less than 30 seconds. So, mate, thank you very much for coming on the show, mate. I might try and get you on for the next one in a couple of weeks' time if you're available. And so definitely get you on then. So,
okay.
Right, guys. Thank you very much for getting on the show there, guys. I'll hopefully still be on here when it ends out. I'm not sure. But, again, thank you very much, Bill, for coming on the show, mate. It's been absolutely fantastic having you on the show.
My pleasure.
And by the sounds of it, everyone's enjoyed having you on here, mate. Fantastic having you on. Thank you very much.
Okay, all the best.
Thank you, mate. Cheers. And that will do it, folks, for this episode of Encounters Down Under. I hope you enjoyed the show, and remember, you can also get involved in the show by joining the Facebook page and getting in on the live streams. Also, please be sure to share with your friends and family to help us grow and potentially find our next guest on the show. If you or you know someone who has had an encounter, please get in touch with me through our Facebook page via Messenger or email at australianufosighting@outlook.com.au. I look forward to seeing you on the next Encounter Down Under. Hooroo!